Tel Aviv has announced the first 2 hostages to be released by Hamas today are now safely in Israel. Mia Schem and Amit Soussana were handed over by the Red Cross to Israeli special forces inside Gaza and have now crossed the border. A further 2 Russians and 8 Israelis are expected to be released later in the 7th group of hostages freed since the ceasefire began. Last night, negotiations for an extension went down to the wire, with an agreement being met just minutes before the truce was due to expire. The ceasefire appeared even more fragile this morning after gunmen opened fire in the West Bank, prompting Prime Minister Netanyahu to vow nothing will stop Israel from eliminating Hamas. The terrorist group claimed responsibility for the attack, which unfolded at a Jerusalem bus stop during rush hour, killing 3 people and injuring 13 more. The thing is, though, that this sort of appalling situation, these killings, it's not as though these killings have stopped. This is something that Israel has lived with for an awful long time. Things like killings at bus stops, etc., bombs, people throwing things, etc., etc. So on that side, yes, it's a ceasefire, and you could argue with Hamas sort of taking responsibility that therefore they have broken the ceasefire. But you just hope that that the ceasefire does hold, because there are still, apart from anything else, so many hostages still left in captivity, 145 in captivity, 93 hostages so far released. And they're saying that they have reiterated that this truce will remain as long as Hamas releases 10 living hostages every day. And actually, I do want to comment on that living hostages as well, because the other thing is that actually not knowing is awful too, or is not knowing whether your relative is actually living or has died in the days since October the 7th.
Horrific.
And none of this answers the fundamental question, which is how is this going to play out? How does this end? But you have to feel that every day of this kind of painful extension, every day of the ceasefire is a blessing, and every hostage on either side that is released is a... Yeah. We have to celebrate that. It's every hour that they're not bombing each other is a blessing, I think.
I mean, and I do think that actually this truce is going to hold. Ever since, Biden, we talked about this yesterday, Biden basically publicly withdrew his support for Israel to continue the hostilities in Gaza. I think that was a clear sign that actually this is the break. I think it's clear that nothing positive can be achieved from, restarting the hostilities after this. But I think it's interesting because we also talked about the fact that the leader of Hamas was part of this exchange, this sort of hostage, prisoner exchange 10 years ago. And obviously he was the one at the head of the October 7th atrocities. It's interesting how the Israelis have approached this hostage exchange now, because obviously the ratio is quite low, given usually it's about 10 to 1, now it's 3 to 1, but also 90% of the people that they've agreed, so the 300 hostages, criminals, or the semantics game is lost on me, but basically people in prison, in Israeli prisons. Of the 300 people that the Israelis have agreed to exchange, 90% of them are teenage boys between the ages of 16 and 18. And of the 300, about 200 are still awaiting trial in Israel's military courts. So these are not the normal courts. They don't have access to the same kind of lawyers, and human rights groups are always... are not comfortable with the level of legal representation that they have, and none of them have been convicted for murder, or convicted of murder. Most of them are there for throwing rocks at IDF soldiers or for petty harassment and stuff like that. So it's interesting how strategic Israel is being in terms of who they are actually agreeing to exchange. The rest of them that are not 16 to 18-year-old boys are actually women. And again, they've not been convicted of any serious crime. They're not even being tried for any serious crime. So actually, Israel is saying, we'll give you the most low-risk prisoners that we currently have in exchange for these hostages at a much lower ratio. So it's quite an interesting strategy. I think they're making it clear that they don't want a repeat of this. Obviously, Hamas is not going to be doing that. Hamas is still going to want to eradicate Israel off the map.
You were talking about that repeat of as I said, I think it was 2011, wasn't it, when it was one soldier was exchanged for more than 1,000 prisoners, including, as you say, the one who was
the Hamas
responsible, the leader for the October the 7th massacres. Oh, I mean...
But I don't even know how... I mean, we sit and hope, and what you said, Esther, is true. You have a ceasefire, it seems futile going back to fighting.
Yeah.
But it can only go back to fighting, can't it? Because Hamas are going nowhere, in their words, and Israel will not continue with Hamas in existence.
Will the fighting get rid of Hamas? Will it make anything better? Will it change it?
It may do over a very long period of time, but in the short term,
And how do you
it's
measure?
it's
Hamas
the air bubble
is
effect,
eliminated.
isn't it?
How,
Well, the thing
what's
is,
the measure of
It's
that?
an ideology.
question is-
You
They
can't
melt away.
bomb away an ideology.
Well, that's the problem. And if they do continue with these hostilities, the remainder of the Gazans in the Gaza Strip will be pushed into the Sinai. And then the questions of, will they ever leave the Sinai? Or this is a way of just pushing them out of Gaza altogether? I mean, I think the implications of that are far bigger than anyone is willing to admit. I don't think quite
fair point.
counterproductive.